The Montana winter didn't mess around. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the world in a blinding white haze. The wind howled through the pine trees, sharp and bitter, slicing through anything dumb enough to stand in its way. At a lonely bus stop on the edge of nowhere, just a rusted signpost and a splintered bench buried under drifts, 10-year-old Emily Carter stood shivering, her thin hoodie pulled tight around her trembling frame. In her arms, bundled in a fraying blanket, was Sophie, her 3-month-old daughter, tiny and fragile against the brutal cold. Emily's sneaker sheep knockoff, shed-worn to death, sank into the snow, soaking her feet until they felt like blocks of ice. Her breath puffed out in desperate little clouds, her teeth chattering as she whispered, "Shh, Sophie, I've got you. We're going to be okay, I promise." But her voice cracked, and the tears stinging her eyes froze halfway down her cheeks. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, her baby or herself. Just 3 hours earlier, she'd been on her parents' porch, watching her life unravel. Her dad, Robert, a big man with a voice like a chainsaw, had hurled her duffel bag into the snowy yard, his face twisted with rage. "You want to keep that thing?" he'd roared, jabbing a finger at Sophie. "Then get the hell out. No daughter of mine's gonna shame this family." Behind him, her mom, Diane, stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her hands wringing a dish towel like it was the only thing holding her together. Emily had begged God, shed begged, but Diane just shook her head, mute and useless, too scared of the church lady's whispers to fight for her own kid. To the Carters, pillars of their tight-knit Baptist community, a pregnant teenage daughter wasn't just a mistake, it was a scandal they'd rather erase than face. "Give it up or go," they'd said. Emily chose Sophie. Now, with the last bus long gone and the temperature plunging, that choice felt like a death sentence. Her best friend couldn't take her in too small a house. Too many excuses. Sophie's dad, Jackson Reed, a college freshman she'd met at a stupid party, had blocked her number the second she'd told him about the baby. No one was coming. Emily shifted Sophie in her arms, the baby's whimpers growing fainter, scarier. "Stay with me, baby girl," she pleaded, her voice hoarse. She started walking, each step a battle against the snow piling higher around her legs, her mind racing. Someone's got to see us. Someone's got to stop. But the road stretched dark and empty, a frozen graveyard under the storm. Then, like a mirage, headlights pierced the blizzard faint at first, then blazing closer. A beat-up old pickup truck rumbled to a stop beside her, its engine growling like it was pissed to be out in this mess. The driver's window creaked down, and a face appeared, an old woman with wild silver hair spilling out of a knit cap, her eyes sharp as a hawk's behind a pair of crooked glasses. She wore mismatched gloves, one red, one green, and her voice cut through the wind like a whip. "You two looking to die out here?" she called, her Montana drawl rough and unpolished. Emily froze, clutching Sophie tighter, her heart pounding. The truck was a junk heap, paint peeling, bed piled with weird crap under a tarp. This lady didn't scream safe, but Sophie let out a weak cry, and the cold bit deeper. "Get in," the woman snapped, "or that storm will finish what your dumb luck started." Emily stared at her, then at the endless white swallowing them whole. Stranger or snow, her gut screamed warnings, but her brain sharp, calculating, knew the math. They wouldn't last another hour out here. She took a shaky step toward the passenger door, her mind whispering, "Who is this woman? And what the hell happens next?" Emily's hand hovered over the truck's door handle, her breath catching in her throat. The wind screamed around her, shoving snow into her face, and Sophie's whimpers were fading into something too quiet, too fragile. Stranger or snow? The question looped in her head, but the cold made the choice for her. She yanked the door open, a blast of heat from the truck's rattling heater hitting her like a lifeline. She climbed in, awkward and clumsy with Sophie in her arms, and slammed the door shut against the storm. The sudden silence, save for the engine's low growl, was deafening. The old woman didn't even glance her way, just shifted the truck into gear with a grunt. "Buckle up if you can figure it out," she said, her voice rough as gravel, thick with that Montana drawl Emily knew from the old-timers at the gas station back home. "Name's Ruth Callahan. That's all you need to know for now." Emily fumbled with the seatbelt, her numb fingers slipping on the cracked vinyl strap, but she managed to click it into place. Sophie squirmed against her chest, and Emily pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes darting to the woman beside her arm. Ruth Callahan didn't look like anyone's savior. Her silver hair stuck out in wild tufts from under a lopsided knit cap, and those mismatched gloves, one red, one green, gripped the steering wheel like she was wrangling a bull. Her face was weathered, all sharp angles and deep lines, like she'd spent decades staring down blizzards just like this one. The truck itself was a rolling junkyard. The dashboard was cluttered with hand-carved wooden figurines, bears, wolves, an eagle with a chipped beak mixed with a couple of creepy antique dolls, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light. Strings of crystals dangled from the rearview mirror, clinking faintly as the truck jolted over the snow-packed road. In the back seat, stacks of yellowed books and papers teetered next to what Emily swore was a taxidermied owl, perched on a cardboard box, its feathers ruffled like it was judging her. The air smelled of pine, stale tobacco, and something earthy she couldn't place, like damp soil after a rain. "Where are we going?" Emily finally asked, her voice small but steady, cutting through the hum of the heater. She shifted Sophie, cradling her closer, her mind racing. "Is this a mistake? What if she's crazy?" Ruth's pale blue eyes flicked to her for a split second, sharp and piercing, before snapping back to the road. "My place, about 15 miles out. Got a cabin, nothing fancy, but it's warm. You two can ride out the storm there." She paused, then added, almost like an afterthought, "Unless you got somewhere better to be?" Emily swallowed hard, the sting of her parents' rejection flashing through her. "No," she said, barely above a whisper. "Not anymore." Her chest tightened as the words sank in a home. No family, just her and Sophie against the world. She glanced out the window, but the snow blurred everything into a white void. No turning back now. The drive was a tense, quiet slog, the truck's wipers slapping uselessly against the onslaught of snow. Ruth muttered to herself now and then, "Mon, old girl, don't quit on me," patting the dashboard like it was a stubborn horse. Emily stayed silent, her thoughts a tangle of fear and relief. She kept stealing looks at Ruth, trying to piece her together. Who lives out here alone? Why'd she stop for us? The woman didn't seem dangerous, not yet, but there was something off, something heavy in the way she held herself, like she was carrying more than just the weight of this truck. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, the headlights caught a flicker of light through the trees. Ruth turned off the main road, if you could call it that, into a narrow, barely there path winding through the forest. The truck jostled over ruts and roots, and Emily gripped the seat, her stomach lurching. Finally, the cabin came into view, a small, sturdy A-frame with a steep roof shedding snow like it was shrugging off a bad day. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the windows glowed a warm golden orange against the dark. It wasn't much, but it looked alive, safe maybe. "Home sweet home," Ruth announced, killing the engine with a groan. She hopped out, surprisingly spry for her age, and forged a path through the knee-deep snow to the porch. Emily hesitated, then followed, clutching Sophie as the cold bit at her again. The trek from the truck to the door was a nightmare's now up to her shins, her sneakers soaking through. But Ruth didn't look back, just shoved the cabin door open and waved her in. Stepping inside was like crossing into another world. The heat hit her first, radiating from a big wood stove in the center of the room, its iron belly glowing red. But it wasn't the warmth that stopped Emily in her tracks. It was the stuff. Every inch of the place was packed with things. Shelves groaned under piles of books, some in languages she couldn't even guess at. Rock-smooth river stones, jagged quartz lined the mantel like trophies. Dried herbs and flowers hung from the ceiling beams, swaying slightly in the draft. A workbench in the corner was buried under papers, magnifying glasses, and what looked like animal bones, fox skulls, maybe, or deer antlers. Weird paintings dotted the walls, half art, half science, with scribbled notes in the margins. And there, tucked in a shadowed corner, was a door painted red with a hand-scrawled sign, "Abigail's room. Keep out." The air smelled like the truck pine, tobacco, earth, but richer, thicker, like the cabin itself was breathing. "Close your mouth, kid. You'll catch flies," Ruth said, hanging her coat on a hook by the door. She kicked off her boots, revealing mismatched socks, and shuffled to the stove, tossing in a log with a practiced flick. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a worn armchair near the fire, its cushions sagging but soft-looking. Emily obeyed, sinking into it with a sigh, unwrapping Sophie's blanket to check her. The baby's cheeks were flushed, her nose runny, but her eyes fluttered open, and she let out a tiny coo. Emily's heart unclenched just a little. She was still here, still fighting. Ruth disappeared into what must have been a kitchen, returning with a bottle of warm formula like she'd pulled it out of thin air. "Figure the little one need this," she said, handing it over with a shrug. "Been a while, but some things stick." Emily stared at the bottle, then at Ruth. How'd she know? Before she could ask, Ruth was moving again, dragging out a wooden drawer from somewhere and lining it with a quilt. "Makeshift crib," she explained, setting it near the stove. "Babies like solid sides. Feel safe." Emily fed Sophie, the warmth of the cabin seeping into her bones, thawing the panic she'd been running on. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. Ruth made a dismissive noise, waving it off. "Don't thank me yet. You ain't seen how I live." She turned away, stoking the stove, but Emily caught a flicker in her eyes, something soft, buried deep. As the storm raged outside, rattling the windows, Emily sat there, Sophie dozing against her chest, and took it all in. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a puzzle, a mess of a life she didn't understand yet. Who was Ruth Callahan, really? Why'd she save them? And what was behind that red door with the warning sign? Her gut told her there were answers here. Secrets waiting to spill out. For now, though, she was warm. She was alive. And for the first time since her dad's shouting had echoed in her ears, she felt a sliver of something dangerous. Hope. Emily woke to the sound of wood snapping in the stove, the sharp crack pulling her out of a restless half-sleep. Her body ached, every muscle stiff from the cold and the tension of the night before. But the cabin was warm, the air thick with the scent of burning pine. Sophie stirred in this makeshift crib beside her, the wooden drawer Ruth had rigged up with a quilt cradling her tiny form. Emily rubbed her eyes, blinking against the gray light filtering through the frosted windows. The storm hadn't let up outside, the snow piled higher, the wind rattling the panes like it was trying to claw its way in. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, 6:47 a.m. No chance of leaving today, maybe not tomorrow either. Ruth was already up, moving around the cabin with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. She stood at the workbench, her back to Emily, sorting through a pile of dried leaves with a pair of tweezers, muttering under her breath. Too brittle damn frost got these early. Her silver hair caught the firelight, and those mismatched gloves still on, like they were part of her, flashed as she worked. Emily watched her, half awake, half wary. This woman had saved them, no question, but there was something about her, something guarded, jagged, that kept Emily on edge. "Morning," Emily said, her voice scratchy. She sat up, pulling the borrowed blanket tighter around her shoulders. Sophie let out a soft whimper, and Emily reached for her, lifting the baby into her lap. Ruth didn't turn around, just grunted in acknowledgement. "Storm's a beast," Ruth said after a moment, setting the tweezers down with a clink. "Radio says it's sticking around 3, maybe 4 days. You're stuck here till it quits." She finally faced Emily, her pale blue eyes narrowing slightly, like she was sizing her up. "I ain't running a hotel, kid. You want to eat, you work. That's the deal." Emily nodded, fast and automatic. "I can do that, whatever you need." She meant it, her pride was bruised, sure, but she wasn't dumb enough to turn down a lifeline. Besides, sitting idle wasn't her style. Back home, before everything went to hell, she'd been the one fixing leaky faucets or shoveling the driveway when her dad was too hungover to bother. She could handle this. Ruth smirked, just a twitch of her lips, and tossed her a broom from the corner. "Start with the floor. Gets gritty with all this damn snow tracking in." She didn't wait for a reply, turning back to her leaves like the conversation was over. Emily got to work, sweeping the worn pine boards while Sophie gurgled in her crib, content for now with the bottle Ruth had left warming by the stove. The cabin was small but sprawling in its chaos. Every sweep kicked up dust motes that danced in the firelight, revealing more of Ruth's world. The rocks on the mantel weren't just decorations. Some had tiny labels scratched into them. Granite 98, Bitterroot River, like a geologist's scrapbook. The herbs hanging overhead weren't random either. Emily caught whiffs of mint and something sharper, maybe sage, tied in neat bundles with twine. The bookshelves sagged under leather-bound journals, their spines cracked and faded, dates scrawled in Ruth's jagged handwriting, 1985, 1992, 2003. This wasn't a hoarder's mess, it was a life, pieced together from decades of something Emily couldn't quite name yet. You a scientist or something? Emily asked, pausing mid-sweep as curiosity got the better of her. She'd always been good at school biology, especially before Sophie derailed everything. Ruth's setup reminded her of the labs she'd loved, minus the sterile white coats. Ruth snorted, not looking up. Was. Am. Depends who's asking. She plucked a leaf from the pile, holding it to the light. Used to teach up at the university in Missoula. Arctic biology, ecosystems, that kind of thing. Quit when the suits got too nosy about my business. She tossed the leaf aside, her tone flat, but edged with something bitter. Now I do my own work. No committees, no bullshit. Emily raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. What kind of work? Ruth gestured vaguely at the chaos around them. Tracking changes plants, animals, weather. Been at it 30 years. This land's talking if you know how to listen. She tapped a journal on the bench, its pages crammed with charts and sketches pine cones. Bird wings, temperature logs. Folks didn't care back then. Now they're scrambling because the world's melting faster than they can write grants. Emily leaned the broom against the wall, stepping closer to peek at the journal. The drawings were meticulous, better than anything she'd managed in her high school notebooks. This is incredible, she said, honest awe creeping into her voice. You could publish this stuff. Ruth barked a laugh, short and dry. Did. For a while. Then I got tired of kissing ass for tenure. She shut the journal with a snap, her eyes flicking to Emily. You're a nosy one, huh? Emily shrugged, unfazed. Just curious. You saved us. Want to know who I'm stuck with? It was a risk, mouthing off like that. But Ruth didn't snap back, just studied her for a long moment, like she was a specimen under one of those magnifying glasses. Fair enough, Ruth finally said, turning back to her leaves. Keep sweeping. The day settled into a rhythm after that. Ruth was a hard ass, no doubt. Every task came with a barked order, but she wasn't cruel. When Sophie spiked a fever that afternoon, her little forehead hot against Emily's hand, Ruth didn't hesitate. She rummaged through a tin box on the shelf, pulling out a bundle of dried mint and a cracked mortar. Fever's normal for babies, she said, grinding the leaves into a paste. Body's fighting. This'll help her breathe. She mixed it with warm water, dipped a cloth in it, and showed Emily how to dab it on Sophie's chest. Old trick. Works better than half the crap in pharmacies. Emily watched, soaking it in. How do you know all this? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. Ruth's hands stilled for a second, just long enough for Emily to notice. Known a lot of beginnings and endings, kid, Ruth said, her tone dropping low, heavy with something unspoken. She didn't elaborate, just handed Emily the cloth and walked off to stoke the fire. By nightfall, Sophie's fever had eased, her breathing steady as she slept in the drawer crib Ruth had rigged with extra slats to keep her snug. Emily sat by the stove, exhaustion pulling at her, but her mind wouldn't quit. Ruth was more than some eccentric old hermit. She was smart, sharper than anyone Emily had ever met. And that red door in the corner, with its keep out sign, loomed larger every time she glanced at it. What was Abigail to her? A kid? A ghost? Emily's gut said it was a wound, raw and hidden, and her brain always, picking at puzzles, wanted to dig deeper. The next morning, Ruth handed her a field guide, its pages dog-eared and stained. If you're going to be here, might as well learn something, she said, pointing to a sketch of a pine tree. That's lodgepole. Burns hot, quick, good for starting fires. Birch over there lasts longer. Steady heat. Mix 'em right and you won't freeze. Emily nodded, flipping through the book, her old love for science sparking back to life. Ruth didn't stop there. She showed her how to split kindling with a hatchet, her gruff instructions laced with a patience Emily hadn't expected. Swing from the shoulder, not the wrist. Let the blade do the work. Days blurred into a week as the storm raged on, trapping them in the cabin. Emily learned fast how to bank the fire for the night, how to dry herbs Ruth picked from a stash in the pantry, how to spot the difference between a raven's call and a crow's outside the window. Ruth named the animals that showed up in the snow. Fox she called Rusty, a raven she greeted as Edgar with a nod. They're smarter than most people, she said once, tossing Edgar a scrap of bread. Emily smirked, thinking of her dad's temper tantrums. Yeah, no kidding. Sophie thrived too, away from the chaos of hiding her existence back home. She plumped up a little, her eyes bright and curious. Ruth called her first real smile a social grin. Not gas, kid. She's seeing you, she insisted, when Emily teased her about it. Watching Ruth with Sophie was weirdly comforting. The old woman's hands, rough from years of work, turned gentle when she adjusted the baby's blanket or hummed some old folk tune about mountains and rivers Emily didn't recognize. But the peace wasn't total. On the fifth sheet, Ruth's satellite phony, a clunky thing, stashed in a drawer, crackled to life, startling them both. Ruth answered with short, clipped yups and nopes, then hung up with a frown. That was Cal, she said, like Emily was supposed to know who that was. Brings supplies sometimes. Says the road's a mess, won't make it till the storm breaks. Emily borrowed the phone to call her friend Sarah, the only one who'd stuck by her through the pregnancy. The connection was spotty, but Sarah's voice came through, tight with worry. Your folks are telling everyone you're at some fancy boarding school. Your mom's been crying at church, calling you her biggest failure. You okay out there? Emily gripped the phone, her knuckles white. I'm fine, she lied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Tell her I don't need her tears. She hung up staring at the floor. Biggest failure? The words burned, but they lit a fire too. They threw me out like trash, she muttered half to herself. I'll show 'em what I can do without 'em. Ruth overheard, her eyes flicking up from the journal she was scribbling in. Freedom ain't the absence of walls, she said, her tone matter-of-fact but piercing. It's having the guts to climb 'em. She didn't push, just went back to her writing, but the words stuck with Emily, sinking deep. Climb the walls. Maybe that's what she'd been doing all along. Climbing out of the hole her parents had dug for her. Nights were the strangest. Sometimes Emily woke to Ruth pacing the cabin, muttering to herself or maybe to someone else, someone not there. Once she caught her sitting by the window at 3 a.m., staring at the northern lights streaking green and purple across the sky. They used to talk to the old ones, Ruth said, her voice soft, distant. Stories in the stars. We've forgotten how to hear 'em. Emily didn't know what to say, but the weight in Ruth's words tugged at her. There was a story here, bigger than the cabin, and that red door was the key. By the 10th day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight spilled through the windows, turning the snow outside into a sea of diamonds. Ruth checked the radio, nodding to herself. Cal'll be here tomorrow with supplies. Then we'll see what's what. The unspoken question hung in the air. What now? Emily had nowhere to go, no plan beyond keeping Sophie alive. But as she watched Ruth teach her how to strain broth from a pot of root veggies, another survival trick, she realized something had shifted. This wasn't just a pit stop. It was a beginning, rough and weird as it was. She glanced at the red door again, its keep out sign mocking her curiosity. Who's Abigail? The question gnawed at her, but Ruth's sharp edges warned her off. For now, shed wait, shed learn. And when the time came, she'd climb whatever wall stood in her way because that's what survivors do. The storm finally broke on the 10th morning, the relentless howl of wind giving way to a brittle silence that draped the Montana wilderness in a blinding shimmer of fresh snow. Emily stood by the cabin's frosted window, Sophie nestled in her arms, the baby's tiny hands batting at the air as sunlight streamed through, turning the icy world outside into a sea of fractured diamonds. The wood stove crackled behind her, its heat a steady pulse against the chills seeping through the glass. But Emily's mind was restless. 10 days ago, she'd been half dead at that bus stop. Sophie's cries, barely audible over the blizzard's rotten days of Ruth's gruff lessons, and the cabin's strange sanctuary had kept them alive. But now, with the sky clear and the snow settling, the question loomed larger than ever. What next? Ruth was at her workbench, as always, her pen scratching across one of those weathered journal spine cones. Temperature logged, the meticulous chaos Emily had come to recognize from her first night here. Storm's done, Ruth said, her voice rough as the pine boards underfoot, not looking up from her scribbles. Road'll thaw soon. Cal's coming tomorrow with supplies. You'll need to figure what's what, kid. It was the same blunt nudge she'd given when she'd handed Emily that broom days ago. No work, no eat, but now it carried a heavier edge. Emily nodded, her throat tight. Figure what's what. She'd learned to split kindling, to soothe Sophie's fever with mint paste, to listen to the ravens Ruth called by name. But those were tricks to survive the storm, not a map for the life beyond it. Town? A shelter? Then what? The blankness of it clawed at her, a quiet panic she couldn't shake. The satellite phone buzzed mid-morning, its shrill ring jolting her from her thoughts just like that night Sarah had called, spilling the first crumbs of news from home. Ruth grabbed it, her answers clipped. Yeah, Cal, we're set. Nope. Tomorrow's fine, then thrusted at Emily with a grunt. Your friend again. Won't leave us alone. Emily took it, her stomach nodding as Sarah's voice crackled through, fast and breathless, the way it'd been when she warned her about her parents' lies. Em, you gotta hear this, Sarah said, words tumbling over each other. Your mom tracked me down yesterday, called me twice, crying her eyes out. Your dad had a heart attack last week. Not fatal, but it shook him hard. She's begging for your number, says they need to talk to you, make things right. I didn't give it, but they're a mess. Emily's breath caught, her free hand tightening around Sophie until the baby squirmed. A heart attack? She saw her dad, Robert, big as a bear, voice like a chainsaw, sprawled on their pristine living room floor, his red face drained to ash. Her mom's tears weren't news, had cried that night on the porch too, silent as Robert threw Emily's bag into the snow, but this desperation was. What you say? She asked, her voice tight, steadying herself like she had when Ruth handed her that field guide to learn fire. Just that you're safe, Sarah said. Didn't spill more, thought you'd want to handle it. Emily hung up, the phone cold in her palm, Sarah's words echoing the way Ruth had about freedom and walls. They kicked me out, called Sophie a shame. Now they want me because he almost died. Anger surged, hot and familiar. But beneath it, a flicker of memory stirred, her dad's gravelly chuckle when she'd reeled in a trout, her mom's soft hands braiding her hair before church. She muttered, they don't get a redo just 'cause they're scared. But the doubt lingered, sharp as the wind, that nearly killed her that first night. Ruth's pale blue eyes flicked up from her journal, catching hers like they had when she'd asked about the red door days ago. Death's a hell of a mirror, she said, her tone flat but piercing, the same way she'd said folks change about the forest she studied. Up to you if it's real or just regret talking. She didn't push, just went back to her notes, leaving Emily to wrestle with it. Is it real? Can I trust it? Her brain screamed no, her heart, bruised and stubborn, wavered. Cal's snowmobile growled up the path the next morning, its engine a rough echo of Ruth's truck that first night, towing a sled piled with boxes, canned goods, coffee, the flour Ruth had grumbled about needing since day 3. He climbed off, wiry and windburned, a native Montanan with a grin that crinkled his eyes and a handshake that crushed Emily's fingers like he was testing her grit. So you're the strays Ruth took in, he said, unloading with a laugh. She don't open that door for just anybody must have seen some fire in you. Ruth swatted at him, quit yapping. Calbert, her scowl softened when he pulled a plush moose toy from his pack, a gift from his wife. She's got a thing for babies, he said, winking as Sophie squealed and grabbed it with both hands. Emily smiled, a real one, feeling the same small warmth she'd felt when Ruth handed her that warm bottle, the first night kindness stacking up, steadying her. They sat over coffee black as tar, Ruth's brew while Cal caught them up, his voice easy like the ravens circling outside. Worst storm in a decade powers out half the county. Town's a madhouse, community centers taking folks in, got aid for people in a pinch. He glanced at Emily, his tone careful, like he'd sized up her soaked sneakers and thin hoodie that first night. Could be a start if you're looking, Ruth cut in, sharp as the hatchet she'd taught Emily to swing. She's fine here till she sorts it. No need for charity lines and nosy bastards. Cal raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee with a quiet smirk, letting it drop. Emily's mind churned, the same way it had when Ruth handed her that field guide. Aid town? Staying? Every option branched into fog, and she was about to ask Cal more when a new rumble rolled up the drive. Low and throaty. Not his snowmobile. Ruth's mug hit the table with a crack. What in the hell? She strode to the window, Emily right behind her, Sophie on her hip, like that night she'd climbed into Ruth's truck. A muddy Jeep crunched through the snow, and a tall figure stepped out, his gray college hoodie stark against the white. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Jackson. Live? He called, spotting her through the glass, his voice cracking on the nickname he'd used back when she was just a girl at a party, not a mom fighting to breathe. He looked different, thinner. His frat boy swagger traded for something jittery, desperate. I've been looking everywhere for you. Emily stepped onto the porch. Sophie clutched tight, her mind flashing to the night she texted him, pregnant and alone, only to hit a wall of silence. Rage boiled up, but she kept it locked down, sharp and cold. That's a good one, she said, her voice steady as steel, cutting like the hatchet Ruth had taught her to wield. Since you blocked me the second I said I was pregnant. Jackson winced, dragging a hand through his hair, but he didn't back off, his boots crunching closer. I know, he said, his voice low, raw. I was a coward, freaked out, ran. But I'm not that guy anymore. Heard through some buddy's social media, random posts you had her. Is that my daughter? His eyes locked on Sophie, wild with something like wonder, and Emily shifted, protective, her brain racing like it had when she weighed Ruth's truck against the storm. He doesn't get to claim her now, but he's her dad. Owes that mean anything? Ruth loomed in the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze slicing through Jackson like it had when she'd barked, getting in that first night. Let's sit and talk first, she said, her tone a command wrapped in grit. I am Ruth Callahan. This is my land you're standing on. Jackson nodded, shrinking under her stare, and they moved to the porch chair, an awkward huddle in the sharp morning air. Sophie's moose toy dangling from Emily's grip. Jackson spilled it fast, like he'd rehearsed it on the drive. A friend saw you in town months back, mentioned a baby. It hit me what I'd done, ditching you. I've been pulling my shit together, got an apartment near campus. My parents are pitching in. You and her could come with me daycare, college for you too. I want to make this right. He leaned forward, earnest, but Emily saw the cracks: his apartment, his parents, his redemption. It was the same trap she'd felt when her dad roared at her to leave, just shinier. And where am I in that? She asked, her voice cutting, sharp, honed by days of Ruth's lessons. A prop while you play savior? Jackson faltered, his script crumbling. You'd study too, he said, backpedaling. Would figure it out. My folks feel awful. Want to meet her? Help. Ruth's snort rattled the porch, loud enough to make Sophie jump, but Emily kept her eyes on him, reading the guilt driving every word. The satellite phone rang again, its buzz slicing the tension like it had when Sarah first called about her parents' lies. Ruth grabbed it, her jaw tightening. Yeah, she here, she said, then shoved it at Emily. Your mom, like a damn tick. Emily took it, her pulse hammering, and Diana's voice flooded through, frantic and wet with tears. Emily, oh God, is it you? She sobbed, the same way she'd cried silently on that porch 10 nights ago. Your dad's heart attack, we almost lost him. We were wrong, so wrong, kicking you out. We've got a room ready, money for school. Come home, bring the baby, we're begging you. Emily's throat closed, her mom's pleas clawing at the scars left from that night. Robert's roar, Diane's silence. She wanted to scream, where were you when I was freezing? But she forced out, they'll think about it, and hung up, her hands trembling like they had when she first swept Ruth's floor. Jackson surged back in, his voice rising. You don't need them. I'm her dad. We can be a family. Emily's eyes flashed, her patience fraying, but before she could snap, chaos crashed in. Cal's snowmobile roared back up the drive, followed by a sleek SUV, her parents' car, the same one she'd seen gleaming in their garage. Robert and Diane stepped out, Robert leaning on a cane, his face hollowed out, Diane clutching a box of sugar cookies like a lifeline. Emily, Diane cried, rushing forward, then froze when she saw Jackson. Who's he? Sophie's dad, Emily said. Her voice flat, watching the storm ignite. Robert's eyes narrowed, his old fire sparking despite the cane. The punk who knocked her up, he growled, his grip tightening. Diane gasped at Sophie, tears spilling. She's beautiful, she's got your nose. Ruth stepped forward, her patience gone, her voice cracking like the logs she taught Emily to split. Enough, this ain't a damn free-for-all. Sit or get off my porch. They sat Robert and Diane on one side, Jackson on the other, Emily in the middle with Sophie, Ruth standing like a sentinel. Jackson pleaded again, Idaho, college his parents' cash. Diane cut in, shrill and desperate. We're her family. We've got a real home, not this hole. She glared at Ruth, her nose wrinkling like she smelled the tobacco and earth Emily had grown to know. What kind of life is this for a baby? Ruth leaned in, her voice low and lethal, echoing the steel shed shown that first night. I dragged your daughter out of that storm when you tossed her out like trash. She's alive cause of this hole. You got no right to open your mouth. Diane flinched, but Robert raised a hand, his voice rough but softer than Emily had ever heard. We messed up, he said, meeting her eyes, his cane tapping like a heartbeat. I messed up. Heart attack showed me damn near dying. I don't want to lose you over my pride. It was raw, the closest he'd come to sorry, and it hit Emily like the wind that night, cracking something deep. Jackson, rattled, snapped, She doesn't need you, I'm here now. I've got rights. Emily stood, Sophie crying in her arms, her control snapping like a twig under Ruth's hatchet. Stop it, all of you, she shouted, her voice ringing out, sharp as the raven's call she'd learned to hear. You don't own me! Sophie's wails spiked, and Emily stormed inside, needing air, needing space. She paced by the stove, rocking her daughter, her mind a blizzard of its own. They're fighting over me like I'm a doll, like I didn't climb out of that snow myself. She stopped by the red door, its keep out sign taunting her like it had every night since she'd swept this floor. Her curiosity, the same spark that made her ask about Ruth's journals, flared, and she grabbed the key from under a rock on the shelf, left there like Ruth had known this was coming. Her hand shook as she turned it, the door groaning open. Inside was a nursery time-trapped haunting. Yellow walls with a hand-painted mural of deer and pines, a crib with a patchwork quilt, stuffed animals lined up like ghosts. A rocking chair sat in the corner, an Afghan draped over it, and shelves held 90s kids' books, their spines faded. On a dresser, a silver-framed photo, a younger Ruth, radiant, holding a baby girl with Jackson's hazel eyes. Beside it, a plaque. Abigail Reed, 1990-1993. Emily's breath caught, her mind flashing to Jackson's last name Reed. Boots thudded. Ruth, her face a mask of shock and pain. Get out, she whispered, but Jackson shoved past, his eyes landing on the photo, then the plaque. He snatched a wooden bracelet from the dresser, his voice breaking. This my mom's got one just like it. She said it was my sister's, died when I was a baby. You're my grandma? Ruth's hand shook, and she grabbed the bracelet from him, clutching it so tight it bit into her palm. Abigail died in my arms, she said, her voice splintering like the kindling Emily had split. 3 years old pneumonia. Storm trapped us 5 miles from help. I couldn't get her out. The bracelet slipped, clattering to the floor, and she sank into the rocking chair, her eyes lost. I cut your mom off, your grandpa, everyone. Couldn't face him after I failed her. When I saw Emily in that snow, holding Sophie, it was like seeing myself again. I couldn't let it happen twice. Jackson reeled, slamming a fist into the wall, the thud echoing like the stove's crackle. Why didn't they tell me I had a sister? He roared, his voice raw. Why'd you run? You left us. Ruth didn't flinch, just stared at the bracelet, her silence a weight heavier than any answer. Robert and Diane crowded the doorway, Diane gasping, She's his grandma? Robert's cane tapped slower, his eyes narrowing. You walked out on him. How's Emily supposed to lean on you? Diane's voice spiked, frantic. She's crazy living out here. Hiding. Emily, you can't trust her. Emily turned. Sophie clutched tight, her mind a storm of its own. Ruth's his grandma. Jackson's family. My parents are here. They're all clawing at me. The room spun Jackson's rage, Diane's panic, Robert's doubt, Ruth's broken quiet. She looked at Sophie, her daughter's cries softening, and felt the truth cut through. Emily burst out onto the porch, the cold air slamming into her like that first night in the blizzard. Sharp and unforgiving, but this time it was a relief, a slap to clear the fog. Sophie whimpered in her arms, her cries softening as Emily sank onto the snow-dusted steps, rocking her gently against her chest. The mountains stretched out before her, their jagged peaks slicing the endless blue sky, a silent witness to the chaos she'd just fled. Inside, the shouting echoed, Jackson's raw fury at Ruth, Diane's shrill panic, Robert's gruff interruptions, but out here it faded to a dull roar, giving her space to breathe, to think. She pressed her cheek to Sophie's soft hair, the baby's warmth anchoring her as her mind spun like the storm that nearly taken them 10 nights ago. Ruth's his grandma Abigail's mom. Jackson's tied to her by blood. My parents are clawing me back. They're all here, tearing at me like wolves. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. Echoes of that night at the bus stop alone, freezing, desperate, mixing with the weight of this moment. She saw Jackson's face, pale and shattered by the bracelet on the nursery floor. Ruth's hands trembling as it fell. Her mom's tears and her dad's broken voice. They want me for them, not for me. The thought hit hard, but it wasn't enough. She had to untangle it, piece by piece, the way Ruth had taught her to sort kindling from logs. She closed her eyes, letting the options play out like scenes in her head. Jackson, Idaho, his apartment, his parents' money. She pictured it. A cramped studio near campus, Sophie in daycare while he studied, her working some dead-end job, maybe waitressing, like she'd done summers before to keep them afloat. He'd be the hero, the dad who stepped up, while she faded into his shadow. Her dreams of biology, of understanding the world like Ruth did, buried under diapers and rent. He'd earn it, but I'd lose me. Then her parents' home, their clean house, college money. She saw the guest room turn nursery, church every Sunday, her mom's sugar cookies on the counter. But behind it, the whispers of the Baptist ladies, her dad's rules, the weight of their guilt masquerading as love. Safety. Sure, but a cage, too. It'd be their good girl again, not Sophie's mom. Ruth was different. Emily's mind lingered there, tracing the days since that truck rolled up. Ruth's barked orders, her steady hands showing her how to split wood, how to mix mint paste when Sophie burned hot with fever. Freedom ain't the absence of walls, it's the guts to climb 'em, Ruth had said that night by the stove, her voice cutting through Emily's doubt like a hatchet through pine. She'd given her more than shelter tools, strength, a way to see the world not as a trap, but a fight worth winning. She didn't beg me to stay, didn't guilt me. She just showed me how. Emily opened her eyes, staring at the mountains, and felt it click. I want that for Sophie to see me climb, not crawl. The door creaked behind her, a sound she'd grown to know as Ruth's heavy boots on the uneven porch boards. The older woman sat beside her, silent as the snow settling around them. Her presence steady like the stove's heat that first night. Emily glanced at her, Ruth's silver hair catching the fading light, the lines on her face deeper after the nursery's truth spilled out. You're not going to tell me what to do, are you? Emily asked, her voice soft but edged with the curiosity that made her ask about those journals days ago. Ruth snorted, her breath fogging in the cold, the same dry sound she'd made when Emily praised her sketches. Ain't my way, kid. You've got a head on. You always did. Figure it out. Her eyes flicked to Sophie, softening for a heartbeat like they had when she'd hummed that old folk tune to calm her. Just don't let him drag you down. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening like the ice outside. She stood, Sophie in her arms, and marched back inside, the chaos hitting her like the wind that nearly killed her. Jackson paced by the red door, his fists clenched, the bracelet still on the floor where Ruth had dropped it. Diane clutched the cookie box, tears streaking her face, her sobs echoing the silence she'd kept that night on their porch. Robert leaned on his cane, his gaunt face a mix of guilt and grit, his eyes meeting hers like they had when he'd taught her to fish. They all froze as she stepped in, and she took a deep breath, her voice ringing out, sharp and clear, honed by Ruth's lessons and her own fire. Jackson, she said, locking eyes with him, her tone steady as the hatchet she'd swung under Ruth's watch. You don't get to roll in and play dad because you're scared of who you were. Sophie's not your ticket to forgiveness. You want to help? Send money, visit when you can, but I'm not moving to Idaho to fit your story. I've got my own to write. He opened his mouth, then shut it. his shoulders slumping as her words cut through his desperation like a blade. She turned to her parents, her heart pounding, but her stance firm, the same way she'd stood against the storm. Mom, Dad, you threw me out when I was drowning, left me to die in that snow. Dad's heart attack doesn't erase it. I get you're hurting, but I'm not coming home to fix your regrets. You want to be in Sophie's life? Prove it, send diapers, call me, show up without chains. But I'm not your little girl to control anymore. Diane's sobs broke louder, her hands trembling around the cookie box. But Robert nodded slow and heavy, his cane tapping like a reluctant drum. Fair, he rasped, his voice thick with something like respect. Well, try him, however you say. Jackson stepped forward, his voice cracking, still reeling from the nursery. What about me? I'm her dad and you're my grandma. He glared at Ruth, his hazel eyes so like Abigail's in that photo flashing with hurt. Ruth crossed her arms, her tone dry but firm, the same steel shed shown when she'd ordered Emily into the truck. Biology's just the start, boy, she said, her gaze steady. I ran because I couldn't face losing Abigail broke me clean through. You want to be family? Earn it like I'm trying to now. No more running. Jackson's jaw tightened, but a flicker of understanding crossed his face, his anger cooling to something quieter. Diane wiped her eyes, her voice shaking. Well, send stuff, anything you need, Emily. Just don't shut us out. Emily didn't promise, but she didn't slam the door either, a crack, not a welcome, the way she kept going after that first night. Ruth cleared her throat, her eyes on Emily, steady as the ravens circling outside. If you're hanging around till spring, we need proper setup, a real crib, not that drawer crap. I've got a house in Missoula near the community college, been renting it, but it's free come March. You could study their ecology, something with backbone. I'd watch Sophie when you're in class. She tugged at her sleeve, then added, gruff but real, got 30 years of journals, needs sorting, you're quick with details. Help me digitize them and we're even. Emily's breath caught, her mind flashing to those nights by the stove. Ruth's journal spread out, her own love for biology sparking back to life. College. A real shot. It wasn't charity, it was a deal. Built on the grit shed shown, splitting wood, sweeping floors, keeping Sophie alive. She saw it. Late nights with textbooks, Sophie toddling around, Ruth muttering over data life she could shape, not borrow. Why me? She asked, her voice soft but probing, echoing her question about Ruth's sketches. Ruth looked away, her eyes on the mountains, her voice roughening. Lost Abigail, then myself been running from it ever since. You and Sophie, you're not her, but you're a chance to get it right. Ain't good at this grandma nonsense, but I'm damn good at keeping folks breathing. The honesty hit Emily like the warmth of that first bottle Ruth had handed her, raw, real, a lifeline. Okay, Emily said, nodding, her voice steady. Let's do it. Ruth's lips twitched. Ghost of a smile, and that sealed it. The others left soon after, Jackson promising cash and visits, Robert and Diane vowing to call, their SUV and Jeep rumbling off down the snowy path, the same path Ruth's truck had carved that first night. Emily watched them go, a weight lifting, lighter than the broom shed swept with days ago. Shed faced them, her past, her fears, and walked away taller, not smaller. Later, as dusk bruised the sky purple, Emily and Ruth hauled boxes from the back room, old journals, a few clothes, a hatchet Ruth tossed in for emergencies. Sophie sat in her drawer crib, giggling at the moose toy Cal had brought, her tiny hands clutching it tight. Emily paused, a stack of Ruth's sketches in her lap, pine cones, ravens, the same ones Shed studied under Ruth's gruff tutelage, and looked around. The cabin wasn't home yet, but it was a beginning, rough and real, like the fire Shed learned to tend. That night they sat on the porch, Sophie asleep inside, the mountains dark against the sky pricked with stars. Emily held a smooth river stone Ruth had given Sophie days ago, rolling it in her palm, the same way she'd weighed her choices that first night. They all wanted to fix me, she said, her voice quiet but firm, echoing her mutter after Sarah's call about her parents' lies. Like him some mess to clean up. Ruth lit a cigarette, smoke curling into the dusk, her voice low like the folk tune she had hummed to Sophie. Folks see what's easy, always have. You're not a messy you're forged, kid. Took guts to climb out of that snow, out of their bullshit. Best lives come from looking at the same old crap with new eyes. You've got that. She exhaled, nodding at the ravens circling above, their calls sharp against the quiet. They mate for life, I know. Don't need blood, just choice. Emily smiled wide and real and tossed the stone out into the snow, watching it vanish like the past she'd shed. That's done, she said, her voice steady as the fire she'd kept alive. We're starting fresh. Ruth grunted, a sound of approval, and they sat there, the ravens slicing the twilight, black wings against the endless Montana dark. Spring would come, wild, tough, full of fight, and Emily knew she'd meet it head on. Not because anyone handed her a life, but because she'd built one, brick by stubborn brick, with the people who chose her back. That was family, not guilt, not blood, but choice, and as the stars flickered on, she felt it. Freedom, hard-earned and hers alone, burning bright like the stove that saved her that first night. So what's the takeaway from Emily's wild ride? This story's about more than just surviving a blizzard. It's about finding your own fire when the world tries to snuff you out. Emily didn't just make it through. She built something real, something hers, out of the ashes of rejection and loss. She learned that family isn't always the people you're born to. It's the ones who choose you, who stick around when the snow's piling up. Ruth showed her that freedom's not handed to you. It's forged, step by stubborn step, with guts and grit. And that's the big lesson here. No matter how hard life hits, you've got the power to climb those walls and write your own ending. It's not about where you start, it's about where you choose to go. If this story hits you like it hit me right in the feels, drop a like down below to let me know. And if you're not subscribed yet, come on, join the crew. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and stick around for more tales of real people fighting real battles. What do you think? Could you climb your own walls like Emily? Let's hear it in the comments.